It was the kind of gentle rain that lingers, steady and soft, the kind that makes the world feel a little smaller, a little sadder. Jack Carter, a veteran, walked home beside his loyal German shepherd, Rex, when a faint sound broke through the rhythm of the drizzle, a child's sob. Across the street, through the rain's silver veil, they saw her, a little girl no older than 6, sitting on the damp grass in front of a small white house. A tiny suitcase lay open, clothes scattered in the mud, and in her trembling hands she clutched a photo of her mother. From the doorway, a man's harsh voice cut through the quiet. "You're not my responsibility anymore. Pack your things and get out of my house." Jack stopped. Something inside him stirred. A memory, a promise, a wound he thought had long healed. That moment changed everything. Stay with us until the end of this story to see how one act of kindness can rewrite an entire life. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you believe that no one deserves to be abandoned, hit subscribe so you won't miss the stories that remind us what it means to be human. Wishing you peace and light wherever you are. The rain had been falling since noon, that slow, patient drizzle that blurred the outlines of the town of Silver Ridge. It was late afternoon now, and the air carried that quiet chill that only early autumn brings. The streets were nearly empty, shop windows fogged, roofs glistening in muted gray. Down the narrow lane that curved past the old church and toward Willow Street, a man walked with a German shepherd at his side, their footsteps leaving faint ripples in shallow puddles. His name was Jack Carter, a veteran who had learned to live with silence. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the posture of someone shaped by discipline and loss. The olive-green field jacket he wore looked worn at the seams, the black baseball cap on his head casting a steady shadow over eyes that had seen too much. Beside him, Rex moved with a soldier's grace, 6 years old, coat of sable and tan, ears upright, eyes amber and intelligent. They made a quiet pair, man and dog, bound by years of companionship and a wordless understanding that comes only to those who have endured storms together. Jack's boots scuffed against the wet asphalt as he turned the corner toward Maple Lane. The air was thick with that familiar scent of rain-soaked earth and distant pine. He was carrying a paper bag with dog food tucked under his arm, thinking only of a warm evening ahead, when something cut through the soft rhythm of the drizzle, a sound so faint it could have been the wind. He stopped. Rex's ears flicked forward, his body tense. There it was again, a high, broken sob, the kind that comes from a child who has cried for too long. Jack's brow furrowed as he scanned the row of modest houses ahead. His eyes landed on a small white home near the end of the street, its porch light flickering weakly against the gray. Even through the rain, he could hear voices, one harsh, adult, and angry, another small and trembling. Something in the tone sent a shiver up his spine, the kind of sound that leaves no room for indifference. He approached slowly, keeping to the edge of the sidewalk. The scene unfolded like a photograph, blurred by rain. In front of the house, on a patch of drenched grass, sat a little girl, no more than 6 years old. Her knees were drawn close, her shoulders shaking beneath a thin beige polka-dot dress that clung to her from the rain. Strands of bright blonde hair stuck to her cheeks, her small hands trembling as they clutched a single worn photograph pressed against her chest. The picture was of a smiling woman, her mother perhaps, with eyes kind enough to tell the story of love lost too soon. Around her, the remnants of a life lay scattered. A small brown suitcase overturned, clothes half-soaked and muddied, a pair of children's shoes toppled on the steps. It was the stillness of that moment, the helplessness of it, that caught Jack's breath. From the doorway, a man's voice cut through the air like a blade. "You're not my responsibility anymore. Pack your things and get out of my house." The doorframe shuddered as he shouted, his words dripping with resentment. He was in his late 40s, rough around the edges, his face flushed with the kind of anger that comes from guilt turned outward. Frank Doyle. Jack didn't know the name yet, but he could recognize the type. A man who blamed the world for his own failures. Beside him stood a woman, younger, with sharp features and crossed arms. Sharon, perhaps. She smirked in cold amusement, as if cruelty were entertainment. The rain seemed to pause just to make room for their voices. Then, with a final sneer, Frank slammed the door shut. The sound echoed across the street, final and heartless. For a long moment, nothing moved. The only sound was the patter of rain on the leaves and the faint whimper of the girl. Jack felt something twist deep inside his chest, an ache he hadn't known for years. He had seen broken children before, in villages far away, victims of wars they never chose. But this was different. This was home. This was right here, on a quiet street in America, and the child sitting there wasn't a stranger in a war zone. She was a neighbor's daughter, small and forgotten. Rex whined softly, his amber eyes locked on the girl. The dog took a step forward, as if asking permission to go to her. Jack nodded slightly, his hand tightening on the leash, not to hold Rex back but to steady himself. He crossed the street, his boots splashing through shallow puddles. The drizzle tapped gently against the brim of his cap as he drew closer. Emily. He didn't know her name yet, but it would stay with him for the rest of his life. Didn't look up. Her tiny fingers traced the edge of the photograph, lips quivering as if she were whispering to the face in it. Jack stopped a few feet away, crouched slowly, careful not to startle her. "Hey there," he said quietly, his voice low and steady, a tone meant to calm frightened soldiers and wounded animals alike. She didn't answer. Her eyes stayed fixed on the photo, wide and hollow, like someone who had already lost more than a child should ever lose. Jack glanced at the small suitcase beside her. The handle was cracked, a tag still hanging from it with faded letters. E. Walker. That name alone sent a faint echo through his memory, but he brushed it aside. "You're soaked," he murmured. "You shouldn't be out here." Still, she said nothing. He could see her lips tremble, the tears mixing with raindrops on her cheeks. When he looked closer, he saw the faint shadow of grief etched in every small movement, the way she hugged the photograph as if it were life itself. Something inside him shifted, that familiar pull between compassion and caution. He'd spent years keeping his heart guarded, but some walls don't hold against innocence. The rain softened into mist as the wind turned gentle. Rex stepped forward and sat beside the girl, his head tilted, ears perked, a quiet guardian offering warmth without words. The girl's small hand reached out, hesitantly touching the top of his head. For the first time, her eyes lifted, meeting Jack's. They were pale blue, glistening with both fear and disbelief. It was in that moment, brief but eternal, that he saw it. Not just sadness, but the fragile spark of someone waiting to be told she mattered. Jack's voice broke the silence, calm but firm. "You're not alone, sweetheart," he said, his words carrying a weight he hadn't intended. He took a slow breath and added, softer this time, "It's okay. You're safe now." The words felt small against the enormity of her loss, but they carried the quiet power of a promise. For the first time, her shoulders eased and the photo in her hand lowered just a little. She looked at him as if trying to decide whether to believe him. The drizzle drew fine lines across her face, but behind them, her eyes shimmered, half doubt, half hope. Rex nudged closer, letting her tiny fingers sink into his fur. The warmth made her breathe differently, slower, more grounded. Jack stayed kneeling in the rain, waiting, not rushing her, not asking questions. He knew that sometimes rescue begins not with words, but with presence, with simply staying when no one else will. The world around them was still gray, but in that small corner of Silver Ridge, something had shifted. The sound of the slammed door no longer echoed as loud. The child's sobs had softened into silence. What remained was the quiet heartbeat of rain and the beginning of something neither of them could yet name. Jack finally stood, glancing once at the closed door where Frank Doyle had vanished. He didn't need to know more to understand enough. The house behind that door had stopped being a home long ago. He turned his gaze back to the little girl and the soaked patch of grass around her. "Come on," he said gently, extending his hand, not as a command, but an invitation. She hesitated for a heartbeat, then placed her small, cold fingers into his. Her touch was light as rain. He felt Rex press against his leg as if sealing a silent pact. Without another word, they began to walk down the street, away from the house and its ghosts, toward the faint glow of the corner streetlight. Somewhere behind them, the rain continued to fall, but its sound had changed. Less lonely now, almost peaceful. In that fleeting walk, Jack realized something that would linger long after the storm passed. Sometimes, you don't find the people you're meant to save. They find you quietly in the rain. Night had settled quietly over Silver Ridge, the rain thinning to a mist that clung to the windows and left the streets slick with reflection. By the time Jack Carter reached Willow Street, the small figure walking beside him had grown weary, her steps slow and uncertain, the child's hand still holding tightly to his. His house stood near the end of the block, a modest single-story home with a wooden porch and a soft amber glow leaking through the curtains. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of pine wood and old coffee, the kind of place that had seen years pass in solitude. It wasn't much, but it was safe, and for the first time in a long while, Jack was about to share it with someone else. He pushed the door open, letting Rex slip in first. The dog shook off the rain, his fur glistening under the light, before padding toward the corner where his bed lay. Jack turned to the girl, her dress damp and clinging, her hair flattened against her pale cheeks. "Come on in," he said softly, stepping aside so she could cross the threshold. Emily hesitated, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar space filled with old photographs, a framed flag, and a wall lined with medals that caught the dim light like quiet memories. The warmth of the room pressed gently against her cold skin, yet she stood frozen near the door, unsure if this safety would last longer than a night. Jack motioned to the small couch near the heater. "You can rest there for now," he murmured, his tone more like an offering than an order. Jack moved around the kitchen, the rhythmic sound of boiling water filling the silence. He poured her a cup of cocoa and set it on the table. "It'll help you warm up," he said simply. Emily approached carefully, her tiny hands cupping the mug but not yet drinking. The steam rose between them, curling like something alive. She watched him quietly, studying his movements, the way he checked the locks, turned down the lamp, and finally sat across from her, his posture steady but gentle. Rex settled beside her feet, his amber eyes half-lidded, keeping watch as though this fragile moment required guarding. The clock on the wall ticked softly, and outside, the wind brushed faintly against the eaves, a lullaby only the lonely would recognize. In the dim light, Jack found himself looking around his own home with new eyes. The pictures on the mantel told stories he never spoke of, faces of friends long gone, fellow soldiers whose laughter still echoed faintly in his memory. There was a photograph of himself years younger, standing beside a woman with kind eyes and a tired smile, the sister he had once helped raise before life sent them down separate roads. The weight of the past hung in the air like a quiet truth, but tonight it didn't feel as heavy. He caught sight of the small girl sitting on his couch, clutching the photo of her mother she refused to let go of, and something within him shifted again. She reminded him of the children he had met while volunteering at the shelter, eyes too old for their years, learning too soon that safety could vanish without warning. When the heater clicked softly, Emily flinched. Her fingers tightened around the photograph, her gaze darting toward the door. Jack noticed the reaction and stayed still, not speaking, only letting the silence stretch until her breathing steadied. "It's okay," he said after a moment, voice low and calm. "That sound just means the room's getting warm." She didn't answer, but her shoulders loosened a little, and for the first time since she arrived, she took a small sip of the cocoa. The warmth seemed to seep into her, coloring her cheeks faintly. It wasn't much, but it was something. A beginning. Rex lifted his head, nudging her arm gently as if to say she was safe now. Her small fingers brushed through his fur, hesitant at first, then resting there as though she found courage in the rhythm of his breathing. Later, when the dishes were rinsed and the lights dimmed, Jack brought out a folded blanket and spread it over the small bed in the guest room, a room that hadn't been used in years, still smelling faintly of cedar and old linen. He placed a lamp on the nightstand, its soft glow filling the space with a muted warmth. "You can sleep here," he said, gesturing toward the bed. Emily stood in the doorway, clutching her photograph, her bare feet pressing lightly against the worn wooden floor. "It's yours for as long as you need it," he added, and though she didn't speak, her eyes flickered with something uncertain but alive. Rex trotted in, circling once before settling beside the bed, his chin resting across her knees as if he had always belonged there. As Jack turned to leave, a faint sound stopped him, the quiet, broken whisper of a child murmuring under her breath. "Please don't let them find me." He paused, his hand on the doorframe, heart tightening at the tremor in her voice. "No one's going to find you here," he said without turning around. His tone carried no hesitation, no question. It was a promise. He left the door ajar so that the soft glow of the hallway light could spill into the room. From the living room, he could still see the outline of Rex beside her and the small shape of the girl lying still beneath the blanket, the photograph clutched close to her chest like a prayer. The night deepened. Jack sat in his old armchair, the hum of the heater mixing with the patter of rain on the roof. He thought about the children he had met at the community center, boys and girls who had lost parents to violence or distance, who built walls taller than their small hearts could bear. He remembered their eyes, how they searched the world for someone steady enough to believe in. Maybe that's what this was now. Not fate, not duty, but a chance to be the kind of person who stayed when everyone else left. He leaned back, the ache in his shoulders familiar, but softer. Tonight. Sometime past midnight, thunder rolled across the hills, low and distant, yet it was enough to stir Emily from sleep. The crack of lightning followed, brightening the window for an instant. A cry escaped her throat, sharp and terrified, the kind of sound that could tear through walls. Jack was up before he even thought about it, the instinct of a protector stronger than reason. He pushed the door open, finding her sitting upright, tears streaking her face, the photo pressed tightly to her chest. Rex was already on his feet, whining softly, his head nudging her arm. Jack crouched beside the bed, speaking softly over the sound of rain. Hey, it's all right. It's just the storm." But she was shaking, her words tangled between sobs. "I want my mom," she whispered, so quietly that it barely reached him. For a moment, Jack couldn't speak. He looked at her, and the helplessness in those small eyes hit deeper than any wound he'd ever known. Then, he drew a steady breath and said gently, "Your father, he was a good man. He fought to make this world safer. And your mother, she'd want you to be safe now." His words came out softer than he expected, almost reverent. "You're not alone anymore, Emily. Not tonight." Her crying slowed, her small frame trembling less. After a long pause, she nodded slightly and leaned into him, the trust fragile but real. Jack stayed there, unmoving, letting her rest against his shoulder while Rex curled up at their feet, eyes half closed, guarding them both. Outside, the storm passed. The thunder rolled away into the distance, leaving only the soft rhythm of rain on the roof. Jack tucked the blanket around Emily and rose quietly. In the hallway light, her face looked peaceful, almost weightless, as if sleep had finally granted her a moment of grace. He closed the door halfway and stood there for a while, listening to the hush that filled the house, a silence that no longer felt empty. When he finally sat back down in the living room, he looked toward the framed photograph of his old platoon and thought about how life had a way of bringing you the people you were meant to protect, long after you thought that part of you was gone. Before dawn, the first light began to seep through the rain clouds, brushing faint gold against the window panes. Jack found Rex lying at the threshold of Emily's room, his head lifted, tail thumping once at his master's approach. "Good boy," Jack whispered. He leaned against the wall, tired but calm, and looked out the window toward the wet, quiet street beyond. For the first time in years, the house on Willow Street no longer felt like a shelter for one. It felt like a place beginning to breathe again, as though kindness itself had found its way home. Morning sunlight spilled softly through the windows of the house on Willow Street, brushing across the kitchen table where Emily sat quietly, tracing lines on a piece of paper with a dull pencil. Rex rested nearby, his head on his paws, ears twitching every time a car passed by outside. Jack Carter moved about the kitchen, the sound of a kettle faint against the calm hum of a home finding its rhythm again. It had been several weeks since that stormy night, and the child's presence had changed the silence in ways he hadn't expected. The house no longer felt heavy with memory. It breathed again, as if life itself had seeped back into its corners. But peace, Jack knew, was fragile, and sometimes the past had a way of showing up just when one began to believe it was over. That day began like any other, quiet, ordinary, with the smell of toast and rain-damp air drifting in through the cracked window. Jack had gone outside to tend to the old truck parked under the elm tree, his jacket sleeves rolled to his elbows. The faint creak of gravel under shoes made him glance up. A man was standing at the edge of the drive, his figure oddly out of place amid the calm of the morning. Frank Doyle was taller than Jack remembered from the glimpses he'd caught that night, with a thick neck and eyes that carried equal parts arrogance and calculation. His clothes looked too clean, too sharp for someone whose conscience was as muddy as his shoes. Behind him idled a rusted blue pickup, and from the open window a woman's shrill voice called something impatient, Sharon, still by his side, it seemed. Jack straightened slowly, his posture calm but his expression unreadable. Frank stepped forward, his voice cutting through the crisp air. "I heard you've got my stepdaughter here," he said, drawing out the word as though it left a sour taste. "Thought we might talk about arrangements." Jack wiped his hands on a rag and studied him. "Arrangements?" he asked evenly. "That's right," Frank continued, his tone oily. "You took her in without asking. Legally, she's still tied to me, and raising a kid costs money. Seems fair you cover some of that, seeing as you're playing hero." The smirk that followed was as thin as the excuse itself. Rex rose from the porch, a low grapple rumbling deep in his chest. The sound made Frank shift his weight, though he tried not to show it. Jack stepped closer, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. The years of military discipline showed in the stillness of his stance, in the steady calm of his gaze. "You left her in the rain," he said, each word measured, quiet, but carrying a weight that stilled the air. "You closed the door on a child who had nowhere to go. You gave up every right to her the moment you did that." Frank's jaw tightened. "Watch yourself, old man," he snapped. "You think you can just take what's mine?" At that, Rex barked sharply, the sound echoing off the houses down the street. The dog moved between them, shoulders braced, eyes locked on the intruder. Frank took a step back, muttering a curse under his breath, and the moment teetered on the edge of something dangerous. The commotion drew attention, curtains twitched. A neighbor across the street, Mrs. Callahan, widowed, gray-haired, the kind who always seemed to know what happened in every home within 3 blocks, stepped out onto her porch. "Frank Doyle," she called, her voice cutting through the tension like a whip. "You got some nerve showing your face here after what you pulled." Frank turned sharply toward her. "This doesn't concern you," he barked, but Mrs. Callahan didn't flinch. "Doesn't it? Everyone in this town knows what you did. Took your wife's insurance money and drank it away while her little girl starved. You left that child to freeze, and now you want to act like you care?" The silence that followed was heavier than the rain clouds gathering over the ridge. Another neighbor stepped out, then another. The small street that had always stayed quiet began to stir with murmurs and disapproval, like a tide turning against a single man. Frank's expression faltered. For a moment, the bravado drained from him, replaced by something close to shame, though pride kept it buried. "You people don't know anything," he spat, but his words landed flat. Sharon's voice drifted from the truck again, sharper now, calling for him to get in. Jack said nothing. He only watched as Frank's face shifted between anger and defeat. Rex's growl had lowered to a rumble, steady and certain. "You should leave," Jack said finally, his voice calm, almost soft. "Go before you lose what little decency you have left." Frank glared at him, his jaw working, then turned abruptly, muttering something that vanished beneath the noise of the wind. The truck engine roared to life, tires spitting gravel as it pulled away. When the street grew quiet again, only the faint rustle of leaves remained. From inside the house, a sound broke the stillness, soft at first, then rising. Emily stood in the doorway, eyes wide and wet, having witnessed more than a child should. She didn't speak, but the trembling in her hands told Jack everything. He stepped forward, but before he could say anything, the words spilled from her in a whisper, heavy with guilt. "He's right. I shouldn't even be here. If I hadn't been born, Mom would still be alive. He always said that." Her voice cracked mid-sentence, the kind of break that cuts deep. Jack's throat tightened, the pain in her tone far more piercing than any argument. He crossed the few feet between them and knelt down to her level. "Emily," he said quietly, waiting until her tearful eyes met his. "No one should ever make you believe that. You hear me?" She shook her head, sobbing harder, and Jack placed his hands gently on her shoulders, grounding her. "Listen to me," he continued, the steadiness of his voice anchoring hers. "You are the reason people like me don't give up. You are why good men keep trying, even when the world turns cold." For a heartbeat, everything stilled, the wind, the distant chatter, even the sound of Rex's quiet breathing. Then she broke into tears again, not of shame this time, but of something beginning to heal. Jack stayed with her there on the porch, holding her as she cried into his jacket, the rain finally starting to fall again in a slow, forgiving rhythm. Rex lay beside them, his body pressed close, as if to remind them both that protection could come in the simplest of forms. The neighbors who had gathered slowly drifted away, leaving behind a silence no longer heavy with judgment, but with understanding. For those who had seen what happened, there was no doubt left about who the real guardian was in this story. When Emily's sobs finally quieted, Jack lifted her gently into his arms and carried her inside. He set her on the couch and handed her a blanket, the familiar scent of pine and warmth filling the space. The storm outside tapped lightly at the windows, but it no longer felt threatening. Emily leaned her head against his arm, exhausted, her tears drying on her cheeks. Jack brushed a strand of hair from her face and met her eyes. "You're safe," he said again, the words softer now, but just as certain. And in her small nod there was something more than agreement. It was belief. As evening settled, the house returned to its calm rhythm. The old clock ticked, Rex dozed by the door, and Jack sat quietly, the events of the day lingering in his mind. He knew Frank Doyle wouldn't be back, not after what had happened. The town had turned its back on him, as justice sometimes comes not with courts but with truth spoken aloud. Outside, the porch light glowed through the mist, a beacon for those who had ever been left behind. Inside, for the first time, there was not just safety, but trust, and that, Jack thought, was how healing begins. Autumn arrived quietly in Silver Ridge, wrapping the town in the crisp calm of golden mornings and long evenings touched with the scent of burning wood. The house on Willow Street stood steady under the elm trees, its porch light glowing faintly against the dusk. Inside, life had settled into a rhythm both tender and fragile. Jack Carter woke early, the scrape of a chair against the kitchen floor marking the start of another day. Emily's laughter was still rare, but her presence filled the small rooms with a warmth that had long been absent. She was growing steadier, more curious, her small steps across the wooden floor now echoing with something close to belonging. Rex followed her everywhere, the ever-watchful guardian whose amber eyes missed nothing. On weekdays, Jack drove Emily to the elementary school at the edge of town, a red brick building surrounded by maple trees already shedding their leaves. She wore a navy blue cardigan and carried a small canvas bag nearly half her size. Jack walked her to the gate every morning, offering a gentle nod before she disappeared into the crowd of children. Rex sat beside him, leash loosely in hand, his gaze fixed on the door where Emily entered. When the bell rang, Jack would linger for a moment, watching the place where she had gone, then head to his part-time repair job at the auto garage. But Rex remained behind, sitting faithfully near the school fence, rain or shine, until the final bell rang. Over time, townsfolk began to notice the sight, the loyal German shepherd waiting with quiet patience, the soldier who would always come back. For many, it became a symbol of devotion, of love that needed no words. The days were peaceful, but not without shadows. At school, children can be cruel in ways they do not yet understand. Emily's soft-spoken nature made her an easy target for whispers. Some called her the stray girl. Others muttered that she was the one the veteran picked up. She never answered, never cried in front of them. She simply lowered her head and carried on, keeping her silence like a fragile shield. In art class, where crayons and watercolors covered the tables, she found a refuge. There, she drew in quiet concentration, sketching storms, dogs, and a man standing beneath a porch light. Her teacher, Mrs. Taylor, a kind woman with silver-rimmed glasses, often paused behind her and watched, sensing the ache that spilled through each careful line. But Emily never explained, and Mrs. Taylor never asked. At home, her drawings began to pile up. Jack often found them left on the dining table or tucked under Rex's bed, a patchwork of color and memory, pieces of the world she was rebuilding in her mind. One evening, as twilight draped the street in blue, Jack found her asleep on the couch, her small hands still smudged with charcoal. Scattered around her were sketches of rain clouds, of Rex standing guard beside a little girl, and of a man smiling under the same roof. Jack picked one up, tracing the uneven pencil lines. It wasn't art in the technical sense. It was truth. He sat for a long while, the quiet hum of the heater blending with the soft rhythm of her breathing. Later that week, he stopped by the local shop and bought her a small box of watercolor paints, the kind with 12 shades in a single worn brush. He left it on her desk with a note that simply read, "For the stories you see." The gift changed something. Emily began to paint in the early mornings before school, sunlight spilling across her desk as she brought her small worlds to life. Jack watched from the doorway sometimes, never intruding, but always near enough for her to feel safe. Rex would rest at her feet, tail flicking lazily, as if keeping time with her brushstrokes. Bit by bit, color returned not just to her paper, but to her spirit. The silence between her and Jack became softer, filled with quiet understanding rather than fear. As winter crept closer, Silver Ridge found itself bracing for storms. The first one came on a Thursday, heavy with wind that rattled the windows and bent the trees. Jack had just finished a late shift when the sky turned dark far too early. He was driving home when his phone buzzed with a call from the school's automated system. Power outage, all students waiting for pickup. The rain began to pour hard against the windshield, and he pressed his foot down on the gas. Rex, sensing something wrong, sat upright in the passenger seat, ears high and tense. When they reached the main road, the wind was howling through the valley, and the storm had already swallowed the power lines in flickering bursts of light. At the school, cars lined up in chaos, parents hurrying their children into the storm. Jack parked and scanned the crowd, his heartbeat quickening when he didn't see Emily. He called her name once, twice, but his voice was lost to the roar of wind. Then, from somewhere inside the darkened building, came Rex's sudden bark, sharp, insistent, echoing through the rain. The dog bolted toward the side entrance, leash snapping free. Jack followed without hesitation. Inside, the hallways were dim, emergency lights flickering like candles. Water was already seeping under the doors from the flooded courtyard. "Emily!" he shouted, his voice carrying through the hollow corridors. A faint cry answered, small, scared. He sprinted toward the sound. They found her in one of the classrooms, trapped behind a jammed door as rainwater pooled around her shoes. Her face was pale with fear, her arms clutching her sketchbook against her chest. "Dad!" she cried without thinking, and the word hit him like a spark in the dark. Jack didn't pause. He drove his shoulder against the door once, twice, until it gave way. He scooped her up, the cold water biting at his boots, and carried her out into the hall. Rex stayed close, barking once, circling like a sentry. Outside, the wind tore at them, the rain relentless. Jack shielded her head with his jacket, running toward the truck as lightning split the sky. By the time they got inside, both were soaked, shaking, but alive. Back home, the storm raged on while the fireplace crackled to life. Jack wrapped Emily in a blanket and sat her near the warmth. Rex curled up beside her, still trembling slightly from the adrenaline. She stared into the flames, her sketchbook still clutched in her lap. Jack poured her a cup of tea, then crouched beside her, searching her face for signs of fear. But what he found instead was something quieter, relief, gratitude, and a dawning realization. She turned to him, her voice barely a whisper. "I called you Dad," she said, as if testing whether it was allowed. Jack smiled, not with surprise but with something deeper, something that had been waiting to be spoken. "That's exactly who I am," he replied. The room fell silent except for the fire and the steady rain. Emily leaned her head against his shoulder, and Rex let out a single contented bark, the sound soft and certain. Outside, the storm began to fade, leaving behind the smell of wet earth and renewal. The house on Willow Street stood firm against the night, its windows glowing like lanterns in the dark. In that moment, they were no longer a man, a child, and a dog brought together by chance. They were a family, formed not by blood, but by choice, by courage, and by the kind of love that asks for nothing in return. The next morning, the storm was gone, the sky washed clean and bright. The town awoke to find fallen branches and puddles shining like glass. Jack brewed coffee while Emily painted quietly at the table, a new picture forming beneath her careful hands, a man, a dog, and a little girl standing together beneath a soft gray sky, the light breaking through. Rex lay nearby, eyes half closed, tail thumping softly. The world outside would never know how close they had come to losing her, but inside that small house, every heart beat with the quiet knowledge that miracles don't always arrive with thunder. They come in the form of those who never stop coming back. Years slipped by quietly, like pages turned by a gentle wind. Silver Ridge grew busier, older and softer all at once, while the little house on Willow Street remained almost unchanged. White paint faded by sun, porch steps creaking under time, yet always alive with warmth. Emily Walker was no longer the small, timid child who once clutched a photograph under the rain. She had become a young woman in her late 20s, graceful yet grounded, her blonde hair tied loosely as she worked in her studio. The walls were covered with paintings, hundreds of them, each telling a fragment of the same unspoken story. They carried the quiet beauty of compassion, the resilience of sorrow, and the peace that only forgiveness could bring. And at the heart of them all was the memory of one man and his dog, the silent heroes who had taught her that love could rebuild what the world had broken. Her career had grown beyond the borders of Silver Ridge. Critics spoke of her work with reverence, describing her colors as echoes of healing. Galleries across the country invited her to showcase her collection, but Emily always signed her letters the same way, from Silver Ridge, with gratitude. Her most celebrated series was called The Silent Heroes, a body of work honoring those who gave without expecting return, who loved quietly and changed lives simply by staying. Each piece held a story: a nurse comforting a stranger, a fireman holding a rescued child, a veteran feeding stray dogs outside a shelter. Yet among them, there was one painting she never sold, one that stayed close until she felt ready to share it with the world. It was early spring when she decided. The art museum in Helena, Montana was hosting her first solo exhibition. Workers moved carefully through the gallery, adjusting lighting, hanging canvases in wide white halls that smelled faintly of new paint and anticipation. In the center of the main room, covered with a silk cloth, stood her masterpiece, the one she had painted last and with trembling hands. She named it The Day It Rained. It captured that fragile moment years ago. A little girl sitting on a patch of wet grass, holding a photograph close to her heart, while behind her stood a tall man in an olive jacket and a German shepherd by his side. The rain fell softly around them, silver threads binding three lives together. That evening, guests began to arrive. Men in dark suits and women in soft gowns drifted through the space, murmuring admiration for the art that glowed under the soft lights. Among the crowd were journalists, local artists, and townsfolk who had traveled from Silver Ridge just to see how far their quiet girl had come. Emily stood near the entrance, wearing a simple navy dress and a modest smile. She greeted everyone with warmth, but her eyes often wandered toward the door. She was waiting for someone, two someones to be exact. When the clock neared 7, she saw him. Jack Carter, now older, hair silvered at the temples, shoulders still straight, though time had softened his edges. His field jacket looked older too, but clean, and the black cap with the word veteran still sat neatly on his head. Beside him, Rex walked a little slower, his muzzle frosted with gray, but his eyes just as alert and kind. The crowd parted slightly as they entered, conversations hushed, replaced by a gentle recognition of something sacred, gratitude made visible. Emily crossed the room to greet them. She knelt to Rex first, cupping his face in her hands. "Hey, old friend," she whispered, her voice trembling just enough for him to tilt his head and lick her wrist. Then she stood and looked at Jack. Neither spoke for a moment. Their eyes carried years of memory between them. The laughter, the storms, the long nights of silence and trust. Finally, Jack smiled, slow and quiet. "You did good, kid," he said simply. And that was enough. When it was time for her speech, the lights dimmed slightly and a hush fell over the hall. Emily stepped up to the small stage, a microphone before her, the painting behind her still veiled beneath the silk cloth. Her voice, though soft, carried with remarkable steadiness. "When I was a child," she began, "I thought kindness was something that only lived in stories. But one rainy day, I learned it can be real. That love can arrive quietly, from people who have no reason to care, and still choose to." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the audience before settling on Jack and Rex near the back row. "Everything you see here tonight was born from that truth. These paintings are about the silent heroes of this world, the ones who don't wear medals or stand on stages, but whose compassion changes lives." She reached up and pulled the silk cloth free. The crowd gasped softly. The day it rained glowed under the warm light, every brushstroke alive with memory. The man in the olive jacket stood steady under the drizzle, the dog beside him watchful, the little girl looking upward with eyes full of dawning hope. It was not a painting of sorrow, but of salvation. For a moment, the entire hall seemed to breathe as one. Then Emily spoke again, her words catching light like glass. Kindness saved me. Family, I learned, is not always bound by blood. It's made of those who stay when everyone else leaves, those who see you when the world turns away. Her voice broke slightly, but she did not look down. For me, that family began with a man who opened his door and a dog who refused to leave my side. Applause rose, slow and heartfelt, filling the room like a tide. Some wiped tears, others simply stood in silence, letting the emotion settle. Jack at the back stayed seated, hands resting on his knees, head bowed slightly. Rex lay curled at his feet, eyes half closed, his tail giving one faint thump against the floor. Jack's lips curved into a smile, soft, proud, and touched by something eternal. The years had taken much from him, but this moment gave it all back tenfold. Around him, the glow of the gallery lights shimmered against the reflections of paint and memory, and for the first time in a long while, he felt no ache at all, only peace. After the speech, guests moved closer to see the painting, speaking in hushed tones about its warmth, its tenderness, its truth. Emily remained near Jack and Rex, surrounded by questions and praise, but always returning to them with her eyes. When the evening drew to a close and the lights dimmed one last time, she walked her father and Rex to the exit. Outside, the air was cool and fragrant, rain beginning to fall again in the faintest drizzle. Jack looked up at the sky and chuckled. "Seems the rain followed us here," he said. Emily slipped her arm around his, smiling through the mist. "It's not following," she replied. "It's reminding." They stood for a moment under the awning as the rain fell softly, not cold but gentle, like an old friend come to visit. Rex leaned against Jack's leg, content. The street lamps reflected off the puddles, scattering the light like fragments of memory. When Jack finally turned to go, he looked back at the building glowing behind them and said, "You turned pain into beauty, Em. That's something few ever learn to do." She reached out and squeezed his hand. "You taught me how," she whispered. As they walked toward the car, the rain deepened to a steady patter, wrapping the night in its timeless rhythm. From the gallery window, the day it rained gleamed faintly, a memory captured in color, the child, the man, and the dog beneath a silver sky. It stood as a testament to how love, once given, never fades, only changes form. And as the doors closed behind them, Silver Ridge's quietest story found its ending not in sorrow, but in grace. A reminder that sometimes miracles don't shout, they whisper. Sometimes the quietest lives leave the deepest marks. In a world that often forgets to look back, there are still those who stand guard in silence, people who give without asking, who carry kindness like a light through the dark. Their acts may never reach the headlines, yet they shape hearts, one gesture at a time. Perhaps that's what true courage looks like, not the noise of victory, but the quiet choice to care when no one else does. And if you've ever met someone like that, or tried to be that person yourself, hold on to that feeling. It matters more than you think. Share this story if it touched you, and tell us what it made you feel in the comments below. Subscribe to join a community that still believes in compassion, loyalty, and second chances. May God bless you and those who keep kindness alive, even when no one is watching.